Okay, I think the topic for today's lecture is history and new directions of Austrian economics, which basically means I can do what I want to do in this. It's elastic enough that it'll accommodate many different topics. The topic I'd like to deal with is one that hasn't been dealt with that much by Austrians, and I see it as a topic that is worthy of research in the future, and that's simply the topic of deflation. We've had two recent bouts of deflation phobia. In the year 2000, there was a lot of writing by academic economists, financial and economic journalists, pundits of all types about the possibility of deflation. And that died down somewhat after 2001. But then just in April, we had a number of statements, first by Alan Greenspan, then later on we had statements by the Federal Open Market Commission when they met in June, saying that the real problem now is not so much inflation as it is a too rapid disinflation. Okay, so not even deflation, but a fall in the rate of increase in the price level. Okay, that the price level was increasing almost at a rate that was too low. And then a little bit later on, after the Federal Open Market Commission met in June, Greenspan again piped up that the U.S. would never run out of the Fed would never run out of monetary ammunition to fight deflation. And then he sort of revealed offhandedly that in fact the Federal Open Market Commission had discussed alternative methods of increasing the money supply, that is beyond simply lowering the federal funds rate, including buying corporate securities, buying stocks, and so on. So once again, he has started up deflation phobia, and I think he's done it purposefully. I think he's done it to divert attention from the fact that we have a very slow recovery, if it's a recovery at all from deflation, and that up until the most recent unemployment number, the unemployment rate had been rising. I think it rose to 6.4%. I think it's now 6.2%. I think for June, or for July rather, the statistic was 6.2%. It was 6.4% in June, and that had been the highest monthly unemployment rate since the recession of 1990-91, which actually didn't end until well into 92 and maybe 93. But the official dating was that it ended in 91. Just very recent, that was the other thing. Greenspan was a little bit restless about the fact that the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, which, even though it's not an official government agency, somehow is the official arbiter of when a recession starts and when it ends. And they hadn't dated the end of the recession yet because of the various indicators they look at. Unemployment was a very important indicator. It was continuing to rise. But they finally retroactively dated it as ending, I think, in early 2001, I believe. Okay. So what I want to do then is to talk a little bit about deflation, and I want to discuss three propositions, okay, that have been put forth by mainstream economists as well as economic journalists. The first is that deflation is close at hand, okay, and has been in the last few years. Secondly, that the effects of deflation are really an unmitigated disaster for the economy and for economic activity and consumer welfare in general. And lastly, that the Federal Reserve needs to take prompt action to head off this impending disaster. And let me give you, there have been many, many articles on this. Just to give you some of the titles, okay, they all bear really grisly and creepy titles, or many of them do. The Deflation Monster Still Lives, Title 1. The Specter of Deflation. The Greatest Threat Facing the U.S. Economy, Deflation. why we should fear deflation, defeating deflation, the deflation dilemma, to be concerned or not to be. Okay? And supply-siders in particular have really been stoking the fear of deflation. And here's one, Donald L. Luskin. Most of them tend to be just economic journalists. And he said in his article, deflation, in his article, I think it was Defeating the Deflation Monster. Anyway, he's saying deflation is, quote, going to be a world of hurt. If you thought inflation was a nightmare, wait till you live with a deflation. Prices of everything eventually go down. Stocks, real estate, wages. Okay, he doesn't say prices of consumers' goods too. Okay, the whole thing. You're a little poorer every day. Well, that's a lie. You're not. It depends on if consumer prices fall at a faster rate, then you're actually getting richer every day. And if you're in debt, then you're really in trouble. You'll have to make those same mortgage payments even though the value of your house is going down every month. But that doesn't mean that deflation is any bed of roses for lenders either. Sure, it's nice to have locked in a stream of payments and money that will buy more and more apples and paper clips and houses as prices collapse. But you'll never get the money because the borrowers will all default. Okay, so where's all the money going? Everybody's defaulting. There's no money. There's nothing. Okay. Well, now the problem with discussing deflation is that there is no good way of categorizing the different economic processes that bear the name deflation. Okay, the name deflation is used almost promiscuously to refer to a number of different processes. Some of them are benign. Okay, that is, they're good for economic efficiency and consumer welfare, and some of them are malign. Okay, or malignant. So what I propose to do in this paper really is to disentangle the various economic phenomena that are referred to as deflation. Okay. First, let me just define deflation. Now, before World War II, and especially before the 1930s, when Keynes wrote, deflation and inflation were, especially in academic discourse, but also in popular discourse, they referred to the quantity of money in existence, or the volume of money. Okay, the analogy, as I think I said in a seminar earlier, if you were here, is that of a balloon. Okay, and Henry Hazlitt uses this. Okay, there's a volume of air in the balloon. You deflate the balloon, you reduce the volume. Okay, if you inflate the balloon, you inflate the volume. That's where initially the analogy comes from, inflating and deflating something. Okay, with air. Well, if you apply this to the price level, okay, it's a completely different analogy. Price level is only two-dimensional. It just goes up or down. Okay, it initially meant a change in the volume of money. Okay, for hundreds and hundreds of years. However, by the 1950s, deflation, okay, after World War II, deflation and inflation were terms that were used to refer to prices. Inflation referred to a rising price level, deflation to a falling price level. This is not an expedient terminology. Remember, all definitions, as Mises emphasized, are arbitrary. We can use any name to indicate any particular economic phenomenon. Okay? However, scientific language should be judged on how expedient it is. Now, if you call a change in prices inflation and deflation, changes in prices inflation or deflation, well, then what you're doing is you're simply taking one result or effect of the phenomenon of changing the money supply, and you're naming that effect while denying a name, while not naming the other effects. For example, under inflation, you have a forcing down of the interest rate. You have a distortion of monetary calculation. You have a redistribution of income. All of those things suddenly are denied a name. But because deflation and inflation are used to refer to a fall and an increase in the money supply, respectively, I'm going to use that terminology in the paper. Okay. Now, George Reisman, when I said this in the seminar, he was adamantly against it, and he said it was wrong to accede to this terminology. But I think if you want to speak to other economists, other mainstream economists, I think there is something to be said for using it in certain papers, especially if you're writing for the public. Okay, though in my academic research, I would still adhere to the original definition. Okay, so what do we want to say about that? First of all, we have to, even in these terms, people are using deflation in the wrong sense. Okay, people are looking, for example, the supply-siders and Greenspan. They might look at the producer price index, the prices of inputs into the economic process, and they see them falling. They'll call that deflation. But that's not deflation. Deflation refers to the consumer price index, okay, which is an attempt to grasp changes in the value of money. Okay, two things. One, consumer goods are the final output of the economic, the final output and the rationale of the economic system. And therefore, it's their prices that should be focused on to tell us whether or not we have deflation. And secondly, remember with Karl Menger, pointed out, and as all Austrians since have held, the prices of inputs are imputed from the prices of consumer goods. Okay, those people who look at, such as Greenspan, who look at the prices of inputs, who look at the producer price index, and say, aha, because these costs of production are going up, eventually we're going to get inflation in the future. Those people who believe that these input prices are harbingers of future inflation or deflation are operating under an incorrect theory of prices. That is the cost of production theory. Okay? So, in the paper, we define deflation as a fall in consumer prices. Okay. Now, what's the implication of a fall in consumer prices? Remember, when consumer prices fall, each monetary unit, each dollar in our case, buys more. So, actually, a better word for a fall, or a better word than deflation, or a better phrase than deflation to indicate the fall of prices is an increase in the value of money. Okay, a fall in consumer prices is simply the other or the obverse side of the coin of an increase in the value of money. Finally, as I said before, deflation can be the result of voluntary interactions among market participants, in which case it's benign, or it can be the result of a government intervention into the economy, in which case it's malign. Okay. Now, there's also two sides to what we might call the money relation. Okay, that is, two sets of factors affect the value of money. Okay, one set of factors is the demand for money. The other is supply. So we get a grid. Okay. So let's put demand for money, supply of money. And let me just make that a little bit bigger, this grid here. So the first type of deflation that I identify is growth deflation. Okay, that falls under the demand for money. And it's a benign deflation. And it's caused by an increase in the supplies of goods and services. And this is the natural state the natural development in the natural development of the market economy. We have increasing supplies of goods and services as a result of increased saving and capital investment, which are then able to embody technological improvements. Much like has occurred in recent years, in the last few decades, in the high-tech industries. Okay, in industries such as hand calculators, video game systems, DVDs, personal computers. Okay, as a result of very rapid technological improvement and the embodiment of these improvements in concrete capital goods, labor productivities in these industries have increased tremendously, driving down the per unit costs of these various goods. And competition then drives prices down as more and more firms adopt this new technology. And just to give you an example, the price of a mainframe computer in 1970 was $4.7 million. Today you can purchase a PC that is 20 times faster for less than $1,000. There's a tremendous deflation in the computer industry. Okay? Now, did that impair in any sense that tremendous fall in prices, and the fall's been estimated at 35% per year in the 1990s for personal computers, has that fall in prices impaired the production of goods and services in that industry? Has it stunted the growth of that industry? Well, again, if we look at the historical data, we see that in 1980, computer firms shipped a total of 490,000 PCs. Okay, that's 1980. 19 years later, they shipped 43 million PCs, which is almost 100 times more. Okay, so the industry has undergone tremendous growth despite the tremendous fall in prices. Okay. Well, someone might say that might occur with specific industries or a group of industries, but when it occurs for the economy as a whole, that is the fall in prices, you get stunted growth, you get stagnant growth, or possibly even recession. Well, again, we have historical instances in which we did have prolonged fall in prices, economy-wide fall in prices. For example, the U.S. from 1880 to 1896, okay, during that period, the wholesale price level fell by about 30%, okay, or by about 1.75% per year, okay. Real income rose during that period by 85%, or 5% per year, a tremendous burst of growth in real income. And in fact, as I pointed out for those in my lecture this morning, we've had falling prices in the U.S. and in Great Britain from the early 1800s to about 1896 when there were gold discoveries. And prices began to rise after 1896 until 1914. By the way, that period from 1896 to 1914 was called the Great Inflation. And prices rose by 13% during that period. That's by less than 1% per year. But because people were used to the market, to growth deflation in the market economy, they were acclimated to that. That seemed like a massive inflation, less than 1% per year. But the fact that it was persistent is what got people's attention. When in fact, the persistent trend was for a fall in prices, okay? Let me point out one other thing. Under growth deflation, wage rates don't fall. The supply and demand for labor stays the same, okay? There is no change in the nominal wage rates. People earn the same money wages, but they grow wealthier as prices of consumers' goods fall. There are more consumers' goods per worker because of productivity increases. So there's no necessity for wages to fall, okay? So I would say that sound economics and common sense tells us that the effect of growth deflation is benign. And you may actually get a few mainstream economists to agree with this. There's an article I haven't read yet, but it recently came out in the Cleveland, it was a research article by someone connected with the Cleveland Federal Reserve that talks about, that favorably analyzes what I call growth deflation. Okay? But many monetarists are still opposed to it. And there's also, there's two factions of Austrians. There are those who follow Rothbard on this and believe that any market-induced inflation is benign. And there are other Austrians, including Larry White, George Selgin, maybe Roger Garrison, that believe only growth deflation are benign. So all Austrians agree that growth deflation is a benign form of inflation. Now, deflation, excuse me. Now, the second type is also on the demand side. It's cash building. We call it cash building deflation. It's usually called, in the popular press and by mainstream economists, hoarding, okay, which conjures up the image of this miser just piling up money endlessly, okay, and fondling it late at night, okay, getting direct utility from the actual money itself, okay? Okay, but actually, hoarding occurs when the individual deliberately decides to spend less of his income on consumer goods and investment assets, okay? And to hold a greater proportion of his income in the form of currency or checking accounts, okay? And I know Antero is also mentally adding money market mutual funds because he believes that's part of the money supply. But in any case, all that is really occurring is that a number of people are voluntarily deciding to hold higher cash balances. But under a gold standard, at any given moment in time, the money supply is fixed. So how does the market economy accommodate the wish to build up your cash? Okay? Well, it accommodates it as any market accommodates an increase in the demand for something by raising the value of that thing. Which means people now will spend less on consumer goods, and as a result, their prices will fall. Okay? So, for example, if in an economy you have $1,000 and the economy produces 100 pizzas per year, and the price of pizzas is $10, okay? Well then, the real money supply, the amount of money in the economy divided by the number of pizzas, divided by the price of pizzas is 100. Okay. Actually, let's say it's 100. Okay. Now, what if suddenly the price of pizzas, because people now want to hold more money, falls? Okay. Is there a way to get more money in the economy if there's only $1,000 worth of gold in the economy? Well, if there's, let's say the price of pizzas is cut in half, it falls to $5. So now we replace P with $5, and now people are holding the equivalent of, 200 pizzas. Okay? So you have 100 pizzas when the price is $10 worth of money, and the purchasing power of money goes up. Okay? Or to put it another way, each dollar in the economy, whereas before could only buy 1/10 of a pizza, can now buy 1/5 of a pizza. Okay? So, by lowering prices, we do have an increase in the real value of each monetary unit, and therefore, the overall money supply in real terms, in the amount that the money supply can purchase, increases. Okay? As in this case, when prices fall. The overall money supply previously was equal to 100 pizzas in purchasing power. Now it's equal to 200 pizzas when the price of pizzas is $5. Now, in this case, wages will also have to drop. Okay? Wages will also have to drop. But there's no reason why wages should drop any more or any less overall or on average than the change in the prices of consumer goods. Okay? So the wage earners won't be any worse off. Right? And without unions, without minimum wage laws, on a free market economy, though this adjustment may take time, people may be reluctant. I mean, we're not denying psychologically, they may be reluctant to take wage cuts. They may quit before they take the wage cuts, and we may have some sort of a hitch in the economy, and we might have less goods produced for a little while. People quickly realize, one, that prices are falling, and two, that there are no jobs at the previous wage rate, that they have to take the cut, and that because prices are falling, they're no worse off. Okay, and after that, they would. There's some sort of institutional memory of all this. People will eventually adapt to the fact that nominal wage rates can change. Now, unlike growth deflation, cash building deflation is not that important a phenomenon. Okay? It generally occurs, to any great extent, only when people begin to develop a pessimistic attitude toward the future, which generally comes about as a result of the beginning of a recession. Okay? But those recessions tend to be induced by government policies to begin with. So cash building deflation, to the extent that it does exist, tends to be a result of government actions. But even if it's not, okay, you may have a situation in which people see, for example, in the computer industry, as prices fell, what did many people do? They held their money back because they believed, even though they may have wanted to purchase a computer this year, they believed that the price would be much lower next year and they could wait. Okay, but all that does, that speculative cash building, is pushes the price of computers down even more quickly. It brings whatever was going to occur in the future into the present. So it quickens or hastens the adjustment process. So if everyone really believed, for example, that prices would be cut in half of automobiles and so on in 6 months, okay, let's say that George Bush was going to take all the, suddenly had an epiphany, okay, that complete real free trade is beneficial to the economy, and therefore was going to abolish all tariffs, quotas, and other barriers to foreign trade in 6 months. We would all know that prices of many different things would fall. There might be a short-term speculative cash-building deflation. In other words, people would stop buying DVDs and other things that they believe, whose prices they believe would fall in the future, automobiles. And the prices would do what? They fall now to reflect that future expectation. Okay. This is nothing to be feared, and I don't think it's, as I said, a big part of the market economy. It doesn't continually recur. It isn't persistent like the growth deflation. But nonetheless, when it does occur, it is the result of voluntary choices among property owners, and therefore it benefits property owners. Okay. Now for the bank credit deflation. Bank credit deflation occurs here. It's a supply phenomenon, and I consider it to be benign. Let me just make this a little bit lower here. And it can occur as a result of bank runs. And something else, it could also occur as a result of monetary policy. Okay. Let's talk about bank runs. Under the gold standard, banks, under the classical gold standard, held fractional reserves of gold. And when depositors, for whatever reason, lost confidence in banks, okay, and attempted to redeem their property, the banks, after paying the first depositors that got there, eventually ran out of gold and therefore went bankrupt. Okay, other banks whose depositors still retained confidence began to worry that their depositors would lose confidence, so they would restrict the amount of lending that they did, which meant that they would hold higher reserves. So for those two reasons, because some banks were disappearing and people's checking accounts would then disappear were failing, and the checking accounts as a result of the bank failure would disappear into thin air, and because other banks were cutting back on their lending and restricting the amount of fiduciary media, unbacked notes and checking accounts that were in existence, for those reasons the money supply would decrease. Okay. First of all, remember, this sort of bank credit deflation can be traced back to an intervention into the system, okay? And that intervention is allowing the bank to multiply the number of property titles to a given piece of property, okay? That is, to a given gold ounce. That's what fractional reserve does. It causes a multiple number of titles to the same piece of property to exist, okay? So this is an intervention into the free market economy. Whether it's done privately with or by government, and if it's done privately, it's certainly done with the cooperation of government looking the other way, or government allowing fractional reserve banking. Not, in other words, enforcing contracts in this case. Well, what is this bad or good? From the point of view of consumer welfare and economic efficiency, okay, is it benign or is it malignant? Well, remember, all it is voluntary redemption of people's titles to property. Okay. The people who are redeeming their property believe that the fractional reserve banking system is no longer to be trusted. They've lost their confidence. Okay. So what is happening is that there is a redistribution of income away from these failing firms to other firms that are more trustworthy. And this always happens on the free market economy. If you take any firm that trades on its trustworthiness, and it could be a financial services firm, it could be an armored car company, it could be a law firm, once these firms lose the confidence of their customers or clients, once it's believed that they're no longer operating in the best interests of their customers or clients, they rapidly go out of business. Okay, they rapidly, the confidence is lost, and they rapidly go out of business. We don't bemoan this fact. We don't say that this is bad because these firms are collapsing. Okay, it's good. It's reallocating resources away from firms that do not inspire confidence. Right? What about the economic effects of all of this? Well, there was a period when we had a free market where prices were and wages were free to adjust. Doesn't mean that they adjusted instantaneously as they would under the never land of perfect competition, but they were free to adjust. This was in the early, actually late 1830s, early 1840s. We had a business cycle from 1839 to 1843. The peak was in 1839. The trough, the lowest point, was in 1843. The money supply during that period contracted by 34%. So the money supply collapsed, okay, by 1/3. And that was the change in the money supply. Almost 1/4 of the nation's banks collapsed. 23% of the banks went out of business, including the Bank of the United States, which at that time was a quasi-central bank. Wholesale prices fell by 42% during this period. Okay, we're almost cut in half. Right? Now, what happened to real GNP? That is, the real amounts of goods and services that were produced during this period. Believe it or not, they increased by 16%. Okay, real GNP increased by 16%, and real consumption, the amount of consumers' goods that people were buying and consuming, increased by 21% during this period. The only thing that declined was real investment. That decreased by 23%, which is the classic, which we would expect from a classic Austrian business cycle, that there was overinvestment that had to be liquidated in the economy. Because the previous inflation during the 1830s had stimulated caused low interest rates, which stimulated investment incorrectly. Now, if you compare this period to the 4-year period from 1929 to 1933, which was the downswing of the Great Depression, we find that the rigidity of wages and prices during this period caused banks to fail. Rather, the bank failures in the face of this rigidity didn't cause much of a change in prices. Prices fell by 8 or 9%. Okay, but unemployment increased tremendously. Okay? So bank failures do not necessarily, in the absence of rigidity of prices imposed by government, do not necessarily cause what we would call malignant effects for the economy. Now, I originally wrote this as a working paper, and I got some comments on it from Austrians who believe that these two types of inflation or deflation are malignant. Okay, the bank-run type of deflation. And one of the criticisms of what I had written was that, well, you never dealt with monetary policy. Okay, what about the case of the Fed instituting a restriction of the money supply? Isn't that an intervention into the economy? Okay? Under the gold standard. But especially under a fiat standard. So let me just, I sort of wrote, this article will eventually come out in the quarterly journal, but I wrote a new section on this to deal with it, and I just want to mention it, mention some of the conclusions that I had arrived at. Certainly under the gold standard, when the Fed reduces the money supply because it's losing gold abroad, that's certainly from the point of view of property titles, something that is benign, right? There are multiple titles to gold. What the Fed is doing by engineering a bank credit deflation, and it usually did this under the gold standard by raising the discount rate, so that banks would borrow less Federal Reserve notes and therefore multiply fiduciary media less. Okay, and in fact, they raised the interest rate, they begin paying loans back, and the money supply would shrink. Let me give you the period during which this was done. There was a 5-year period During the war, and a little bit after World War I, the U.S. money supply from 1916, okay, through, let's see, through 1920, it rose by about 15% per year, and the CPI increased by about 14% per year. We had tremendous inflation during this period, okay. The Fed began to recognize that this was very dangerous, that there was tremendous inflation going on. So in 1919, it raised its discount rate from 4 to 4.75%. And it continued to raise it right through June of 1920, so that by June it was up to 7%, okay? And it held it there until 1921, okay? The consequence was a steep decline in the annual rate of growth in the money supply. In 1920, the money supply was growing only by 2.9% instead of 15%. And in 1921, it shrunk by about 8%. So the Fed engineered a decrease in the money supply. It deliberately brought about a monetary deflation. And the result in terms of prices was that prices fell in 1921 by over 16%. Okay, that's the overall GDP deflator. And by 8%, it fell in 1922. Consumer prices fell by 11% in 1921 and by about 6% in 1922. Okay, and wholesale prices dropped even more. Okay, in the year from the middle of 1920 to 1921, wholesale prices fell by more than half. They fell by 56%. Okay, but what's interesting about this period is that one Keynesian observer, Robert Gordon, who's a famous Keynesian analyst of economic fluctuations, pointed out that the downswing was severe but relatively short. Okay, it was over within 11, 12 months. Its outstanding feature was the extreme decline in prices. Government policy to moderate the depression and speed recovery was minimal. Okay, government didn't do anything in terms of deficit spending and public works. The Federal Reserve authorities were largely passive, nor was any use made of fiscal policy. In short, the federal budget was deflationary while the downswing was in progress. Despite the absence of a stimulative government policy, however, recovery was not long delayed. There's also a macroeconomist, a macroeconomics historian, who's very good. He's written a short book on fiscal and monetary policy in the United States, Kevin Weyer, from 1913 until mid-1990s. And he's a monetarist, and monetarists hate when prices fall, especially as a result of a falling money supply. And he blamed the Fed for all of this. He says the Fed earned all the criticism it has since received for inaction in the face of such a severe contraction, accompanied as it was by unprecedented deflation. Okay, the Fed did nothing, but yet he was baffled. Okay, he called this, quote, contraction deflation of historic proportions. Okay, but he was very, very surprised that it didn't lead to total financial and economic ruin, and that the economy rapidly and smoothly returned to prosperity. And he admitted, quote, the Fed was not really called on to act as a lender of last resort to the banking system because the system never really faced a major liquidity crisis. Why such relative calm persisted compared with the situation in earlier contraction periods is unclear. Okay, because you can't explain it by monetarist theory. Okay, so there was no problem. Okay, or there was no major problem here. Okay, and it moved the economy back toward 100% reserves. Now, surely then, even though I might say under a gold standard this is a good deflation, and George Reisman agreed with me in the seminar, he disagreed with me when I said there are some reasons, and I'm not completely in favor of a deflation, even when we have a fiat currency like we have today. Okay, and by the way, Mises and Rothbard were both against this type of deflation. Okay, they saw no reason why under a fiat currency, even if you want to go back to a gold standard, you should have a monetary deflation. Well, first of all, let's just talk in relative terms. Would you rather have an inflation of 3% per year or a deflation of 2 or 3% per year? Well, I found this statement by Hayek, who courageously warned at the height of the Keynesian era in 1960, okay, in his book, The Constitution of Liberty. He gave us the following warning. He says, it is, however, rather doubtful whether from a long-term point of view, deflation is really more harmful than inflation. Indeed, there is a sense in which inflation is infinitely more dangerous and needs to be carefully guarded against. Of the two errors, it is the one much more likely to be committed. Still quoting, the difference between inflation and deflation is that, with the former, the pleasant surprise comes first and the reaction later, while with the latter, the first effect on business is depressing. There is little need to take precautions against any practice, the bad effects of which will be immediately and strongly felt. But there is need for precautions wherever action which is immediately pleasant, such as inflation, or relieves temporary difficulties, involves much greater harm that will be felt only later. Okay? And then he ends up saying, because inflation is psychologically and politically so much more difficult to prevent than deflation, and because it is at the same time technically so much more easily prevented, the economist should always stress the dangers of deflation. Okay, so even if deflation and inflation have the same bad effects, and there's no reason to, the anti-deflationary Austrians should agree that deflation is no worse than deflation should be no worse than inflation. Well, then we would seem, on Hayek's argument, to prefer a mild deflation. That is, the Fed should lean towards deflation, a few percent per year decline in the money supply, okay, to avoid any prospect of inflation occurring, okay? But I want to go beyond that. Now, let me just talk about Mises and Hayek, okay? Mises and Rothbard, okay? Mises basically repeated Hayek's argument in human action, okay? Basically, he says that, look, no one's really ever in favor of deflation because the immediate effects are negative, so we don't have to really worry about it. He doesn't discuss it much. But in an earlier book, his book on a theory of money and credit, which was written before the dread of falling prices that Keynes instilled in the popular and academic writers, Mises focused on the fact that deflation won't occur because of the narrowly economic interests of the ruling class, okay, which is very interesting. That is, that deflation hurts the ruling class and for the most part benefits those people who are not direct recipients of government purchases or government subsidies. And he says restrictionism or deflationism demands positive sacrifices from the national exchequer, in other words, Treasury, when it is carried out by the withdrawal of notes from circulation and their cancellation. Okay? So in the old days, if you wanted to deflate, the Treasury would simply tax more than it spent, and it would just destroy the excess notes. And he says, and at the least, it demands from it a renunciation of potential income by forbidding the issuance of notes at a time when the demand for money is increasing. Okay, then he goes on, he says, but furthermore, an increase in the value of money, which is deflation, has not been to the advantage of the ruling classes. Those who get an immediate benefit from such an increase are all those who are entitled to receive fixed sums of money. Creditors gain at the expense of debtors. Taxation, it is true, becomes more burdensome as the value of money rises, but the greater part of the advantage of this is secured not by the state, but by its creditors, okay, by bondholders. Now, policy favoring creditors at the expense of debtors have never been popular, okay? But yet, Mises now, even though he has this insight into deflation hurting the government and those who are directly recipients of their spending and benefiting other classes, is still against deflation. And in Theory of Money and Credit, he tells us that even in the case of returning to the gold standard, it's a mistake to try to deflate the money supply. Okay, he criticizes Great Britain after the Napoleonic Wars, when they returned to the gold standard by decreasing the amount of money in circulation, and after World War I, when they did the same thing. Even Murray Rothbard, who is an enthusiastic proponent of bank credit deflation, he loves when banks collapse, fractional reserve banks collapse spontaneously, okay, is against monetary policy-induced deflation under a fiat standard. Thus, he called the crucial British error and fateful decision of returning to the gold standard in the 1920s at the pre-war parity. In other words, Britain had to deflate the money supply by about 10% to reestablish the old parity of gold and the pound. Okay, and Rothbard goes on to say, the sensible thing to do would have been to recognize the facts of reality. the fact of the depreciated pound, franc, mark, and to return to the gold standard at a redefined rate, a rate that would recognize the existing supply of money and price levels, unquote. Okay? And then additionally, when he writes he has two different types of, two different proposals for returning to gold in the U.S. Both of those proposals are designed in a way to prevent a deflation of the money supply. So I thought more about this. Oh, and then Rothbard, by the way, also recognizes the following. He says that in the case of a deflationary bank credit contraction, in a broad sense, takes away from the original coercive gainers from credit expansion and benefits the original coerced losers. While this will certainly not be true in every case, in the broad sense, much the same groups will benefit and lose, but in a reverse order from that of the redistributive effects of credit expansion. Fixed income groups, widows and orphans will gain, and business and owners of original factors previously reaping gains from inflation will lose. So what Rothbard is saying is the following. If we have what I call fiscal deflation, if the government, for some reason, destroys some of the money that it takes in, doesn't spend it all, who is hurt? Well, the government itself. Okay, the politicians and bureaucrats have less money to play with. The people who receive the money, groups that are subsidized, like farmers and so on, are hurt. And various contractors for the government and their employees, defense contractors, have less money. Okay, all other things equal. Okay, the level of taxation equal. Okay, if government cuts spending below taxation, destroys that money, that excess. Prices then begin to fall because these people receive less money directly from government than before. Their incomes fall, they spend less, prices go down. Who's benefited? People like you and I who do not work for government. So this is really the opposite effect of a certain effect that we talk about in economics that stems from inflation. And that effect is called seigniorage. The seigniorage effect is the effect that occurs when the government creates new money and is the first one to spend it before prices rise. The government, in that way, reallocates money from the rest of real resources, from the rest of society to itself and to those who first receive the newly created money. So when the government runs a deficit that is financed by printing of new money, there's a seigniorage effect. Okay, it's able to seize more real resources. Well, I looked around in my French dictionary, come up with an effect that no one has really named, because no modern economist talks about deflation and monetary policy. And the term I came up with was rabotage. And rabotage means abatement or diminution. Okay. The rabotage effect reduces the fiscal burden on society. Okay? This rabotage effect. That is, all other things equal, including nominal tax revenues, as the government reduces its spending below this and destroys some of the currency, you get this rabotage effect. You get an increase in productivity as real resources are released to the rest of the productive sectors of society. And I even came up with a little example, and I won't go into too much detail, but what the government could do is as follows. It can take these extra dollars that it doesn't destroy, okay, it's in effect destroying them, and it can simply add them to the reserves of the banks and at the same time raise the reserve ratio. So just to give you one step here, let's say you have the money stock, the fiat money stock is $1,000. And initially, let's say that the reserve ratio is 10%, so that, and all money is held, let's say, in checking accounts. There's no currency, just to make this simple. So that you have the money supply and the amount of reserves in the economy. Now, let's say that the Treasury runs a surplus of $20, okay, in this year, and it takes that $20 and what happens is that the Treasury will then, basically, when the Treasury gets money, it puts it in the commercial banks. Okay, when it gets money from taxes, it puts it in the commercial banks, what are called tax and loan accounts. Okay, so the Treasury has $20 in tax and loan accounts. So there's no effect on the money supply. You pay this $20 in taxes, okay? The demand deposit shifts from your control to Treasury's control. When the Treasury spends it, however, when it's ready to spend it, it shifts the $20 to the Federal Reserve System, okay? So the banks lose $20 of reserves. So what the Treasury always tries to do is that it spends the $20 as it's shifting another $20 so that the money gets back into circulation and goes into the banks. So my plan would be to take the $20, put it in the Federal Reserve. That would reduce the reserves of the banks to $80 temporarily. They would have to shrink the money supply to $800, because now they only have $80. And then, now that it is in the Treasury, now that it's in the Federal Reserve, simply raise reserve requirements to, what's 1/8, about 16%? 12%? Yeah, 12.4. Raise reserve requirements to 12.5%, add it to the bank's reserves, so you have the fall in the money supply by $200. You've done it indirectly. You've used this excess, this surplus of dollars. In effect, you're destroying money, but you're doing it in a way that's moving back towards 100%. Anyway, you don't have to do it at, decrease the money supply 20% in a given year. You can do it very slowly, 2 or 3% per year, fiscal deflation, and keep building up the reserves of banks and shrinking the money supply over time, and you can get back over time to 100% gold standard. Now, I'm not saying that that's the best way to do it. Okay? You get back to 100% banking and then go back onto the gold standard while having 100% banking already. I'm not saying that's the best way to return to a gold standard. What I'm saying then is that there are two important positive effects that derive or that result from deflationary monetary policy. One is a arbitrage effect. That is releasing real resources to be used in productive ways. Shifting real income away from those who receive it from government to others who are in the completely private sector. And secondly, it is a way of moving back towards 100% reserves. You can construct a scenario in which you can move back towards 100% reserves. Now, that makes deflationary monetary policy superior to inflationary monetary policy, which you're always moving away from 100% reserve system. Okay, you're always multiplying titles to the ultimate cash of the system. Here, you're reducing the pseudo titles. Okay, and in addition, you are moving back towards 100% reserves, which might make it easier to go back to the gold standard. So I would say I would give this 2 cheers. I wouldn't want the Federal Reserve increasing the money supply 5% one year and decreasing it 2% the next year. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, though, you can construct a scenario in which monetary policy, deflationary monetary policy is beneficial. Okay. Okay. And by the way, this was done, not exactly in the scenario I gave, but this was done, I found a great recent article in the front page of a St. Louis Fed publication. Just as I was writing this, it was just amazing. It's called, no, that's not it. I do have it. Oh, here it is. No, it's not it either. Well, I don't see it, but yes, I do. Here it is. It says deflation, corrosive and otherwise. And very interestingly, they take this is the July 2003 National Economic Trends from the St. Louis Fed. They take the period in the U.S. from 1876 to 1879. Okay, during that period, there was a tremendous decrease in the money supply. The money supply decreased by about 9% because they were trying to go back to the gold standard and get rid of the greenbacks. Increased by about 9%. The CPI fell 4% a year over those 4 years from 1876 to 1879. Yet real GDP grew by 5.2% per year during that period, during this contractionary monetary policy. Okay. And they don't and then they compare that to what happened in 1930 and 1933. They don't really give us much reason why the difference. But they basically say that we should, go back and look. And not all deflation is what they call corrosive, what I call malign. They say some instances of deflation may not be, and that we should go back and look more closely. Okay, and I agree with that. So that's. There was one other thing I wanted to say about that, company. But finally, let me just talk about the only malign type of inflation I identify as confiscatory. You can read my articles on Mises.org on Argentina that I've written. I've written 2 articles on this. Confiscatory deflation basically occurs, and I mentioned this also. We talked a little bit about it in the seminar the other day. It occurs when government steps in to save a failing banking system, to prevent a bank credit deflation, and seizes demand deposits that have already been created from their owners. Okay? Doesn't allow their owners to take them out. Okay? Or to have full access to them. And that's what's occurred in Argentina. And to finish up, this is not in my article on Argentina, but what results from that confiscatory deflation is a movement back towards barter. And in the original article, if you see one of the articles I wrote, I predicted that Argentina would go back towards barter because many of the poor Argentines have accounts that do not allow checkability. They can't write checks on their account, and they don't have credit cards. And because of the limited withdrawal privileges, they don't have enough money to run their everyday affairs, and retailers were suffering. Well, what was interesting is a few months ago on Mises.org, Jeff Tucker put up an article in which pointed out that people now are using corn, soybeans, sunflowers, and wheat as legal tender. As they say, legal tender. It's not legal tender. As a medium of exchange in Argentina. Okay. And titles to the quantities of these various goods. And one businessman said, it's like a return to the Phoenician era. Okay? His family-owned company has completed $168 million in deals among farmers, corporate customers, and grain exporters this year. About 60% of his business is based on bartering. Okay? Automobile sales have slid 61% this year, again, because of the demonetization of the economy caused by this confiscatory deflation. But rural dealerships say bartering has helped to cushion the blow. Many independent auto dealerships began taking grain in lieu of cash months ago. Ford Motor, General Motors, Toyota Motor have started countrywide sales pitches and are teaching employees how to swap vehicles for grains. Last month, Daimler Chrysler joined the trend with its grain plan, quote unquote, which allows customers to use grain to buy Mercedes-Benz, Chryslers, Jeeps, Dodge vehicles. Okay? It says this form of trade goes back to the very beginning. You give me a pencil and I'll give you a glass, said an accountant. Okay? And so on. So that's the bad kind of deflation. That's the kind that has malignant effects on economic efficiency and consumer welfare. I'll stop there and take maybe one quick question. Yeah. Right. This is basically taxonomy, but it's expanded. No, the period. I expand this article. That was just a working paper to take account of these criticisms of my working paper. Yeah, I think it's also on Mises.org. It's called 2 Cheers for Deflationary Monetary Policy. But I actually wrote that revision before I saw this article in the Federal Reserve Bank periodical, which I then went back and I looked more closely at other books about that period of the greenbacks. So that'll be in the final article. Okay? Okay. I'll stop here. If you have any questions, you can come up and ask me. Thank you.